Hello, everyone, and welcome to topic 3 for this semester. So, we're going to jump right into what we're going to consider and talk about, which is moral development. So, let's get started. So, let's first get started by defining what moral development is. Moral development is the change in reasoning based off our experiences that we have, the experiences that we've endured, and what we consider then being right and wrong based on those experiences. Those do change over time, and we have what we can consider right and wrong emotions and right and wrong behavior. So this develops throughout our whole childhood. It also develops into adulthood as we learn and we endure new experiences. But there are some components to it that I want us to think about. The first one is how we think about right and wrong. So the big and key word is think here. So it's how we think about what right and wrong is based on our experiences. It's also, we have a component of feeling. So it's how we feel when something is wrong. What do we do? How do we act? How do we behave? How do we feel? And how do we respond to that? Also, we have, as we go through our life and through development, whether moral becomes part of our identity. So whether or not this is something we relate with very deeply about being morally right, about living with a certain type of morals, and they are a part of our identity. A lot of times we get that if someone is embedded in a religion or spirituality or a different belief system, then we get to, or then that person then uses that as part of their identity. And then also how we behave. So our moral development impacts the choices that we make, the choices that we don't make, and how we behave overall. So these are kind of the key components to moral development, and overall moral development establishes itself throughout our whole life. So now we're going to begin with moral development through the infancy/toddler stage. So the first point I want to talk about is how babies perceive social interaction. A landmark study by Hamlin in 2007 found that pre-verbal infants have a distinct preference for what we may consider helpers. So to kind of set the stage a little bit, in these experiments, babies watched a puppet show where one character tried to climb a hill. A helper puppet pushed them up while a hinderer puppet pushed them down. So when given the choice afterwards, the majority of the babies actually reached for the helper thereafter. So this then, suggests through the research that we are born with the idea of social evaluation in the sense that we prefer those who are helpful, than those who are hinderers. Also, if we think of spontaneity in helping in toddlers, as infants typically grow into toddlers, their preference turns into actually action towards others. So another research study done in 2009 showed that toddlers will help a stranger without actually being asked. So if an adult accidentally drops a clothespin, or for instance, let's say struggles to open a cabinet, the toddler will actually be seen waddling over to help pick up or help open that door. So what's ultimately fascinating about this is without the expectation of a reward, it actually appears that it is an intrinsic drive on how they can be useful for other people. And then also, if we think about point number 3 here, is that finally we see that seeds of empathy actually develop within the first year of life. So you've likely seen this maybe if you've ever observed children at a daycare setting or a setting where there's a lot of babies. Maybe your friends have children, things like that. But if one baby starts crying, others often start too. So this is what we may consider like global empathy. So it's the idea by they are viewing other people, so therefore they're experiencing empathy by viewing other people and by watching other babies. So by the end of the first year, it's actually seen that babies often mature into these different emotional responses, which is actually very unique. So they ultimately then begin to realize that your distress as a parent or a caregiver or a primary person in their life is different from their distress. And a lot of times it often refers to what we may consider a security object. So it can be a blanket or the comfort of something else, but ultimately that helps soothe when this distress ultimately is occurring. So overall, if we kind of sum this up all together, there is some big takeaways here, and it's that morality doesn't just start with a lecture from a parent or a teacher. It actually begins with the basic social understanding of when we are actually infants. And it really begins before a child can ultimately talk, which is actually quite incredible. So we are quite literally wired to be social and moral beings from the start. So I want us to think about that with an infancy stage. Now let's get into early childhood. So, as we shift from infancy to early childhood, one of the biggest shifts we actually see is our ability, or children's ability, to distinguish between two types of rules. So, research done in 81 and 83 shows that young children actually recognize rules about harm and rules about fairness. So, for example, they know hitting is wrong because it physically hurts. Other rules are generally seen as like social order, so whether or not they're going to be accepted or not. So, like wearing pajamas to school or sitting in a specific seat. But actually, interesting enough, research states that if you were to ask a child if a teacher said it was okay to hit someone, they would respond with no, because they know, generally speaking, it's morally wrong. But if you ask if the teacher said it was okay to wear pajamas, would it be okay? Then they would generally say yes. So they recognize that moral rules are more pertinent than actual social rules. However, there are going to be instances where they're going to choose rules that fit both of those, moral and social. So ultimately, there's a rise of moral emotions within children in this stage. So this is also the age where there's emergence of self-consciousness of emotions. So children begin to feel guilt when they hurt someone, feeling as if that's not okay when they engage with someone in that way. So this isn't just fear of being caught, but it's actually internal discomfort that in early childhood they actually feel. Also, in this stage, children often become fairness fanatics. So we may kind of say that in the sense of you may have seen like someone around the age of 3, 4, 5 realize their sibling maybe got more goldfish than them, and they will kind of maybe potentially announce or respond very strongly in the sense of that's not fair, there's a sense of unfairness. So their moral world at this stage is very black and white in whether things are fair or not fair. So that's a good visualizations for you to think about what it kind of looks like in early childhood. But also we're developing internal standards. So we see in this stage that children are starting to care more about spirit of fairness rather than just following a command per se. This behavior also actually starts when they're driven by kind of this internal sense of how things should be, rather than just like, I will get in trouble if I do this. So this is where that word should within therapy, we generally as a therapist, we try to identify when we're using that sense of should, because then that leads to the guilt principle. But generally speaking, they think about how things should be, not just if I do this, would I get in trouble. So overall, kind of the takeaway per se of this stage is that in early childhood, morality moves from kind of a simple gut feeling to more structured views of thinking, structured rules, with definitely an emphasis on fairness and also prevention of harm. So let's see what it's like in adolescence. So as we move into adolescence, moral development actually takes a massive link from fairness to not wanting to hurt someone to the ability for us to think a lot more abstractly and a lot more critically, per se. We stop just looking at the rules of what's black and white, as I said, kind of fairness, what's fair and not fair, and we start to look at the why behind things. So this is where in that stage in adolescence where children, you'll often see them ask the question, why do their primary caregivers? Well, why did that occur? Why is that happening? Because they want to get the understanding from the background sense in order to justify what's kind of going on. Research was done basically defines that there are 3 different specific kind of levels of reasoning and stages of reasoning throughout our development. So first, in Kohlberg's stages, we have self-interest. This is kind of in early adolescence the primary question we often ask, which is what's in it for me? Per se, the focus is on rewards. We want to get something out of it and also avoiding any personal trouble for ourselves. So we want to get something out of our decisions. As we mature from adolescence, then we move into kind of the following rules kind of situation and area. This isn't just about fear of a parent anymore. It's about maintaining social order, accepted as being accepted by peer groups and social groups, and just gaining approval overall. This is where you'll see in that middle school, high school age group where there's a big kind of need to conform to what is considered good or what is considered that you will fit in. So it's kind of about following the rules of the social structure at this time. You want to seem like a good person to society, but society is kind of their peers and their classmates and the people that they're surrounded by that are at that same kind of age. Also, we have the principled thinking aspect. This is the highest level where rules are actually weighted against kind of broader principles of justice and universal human rights that we have. And at this stage, adolescents might, argue that a rule should be broken if it's fundamentally unjust, if it's maybe not against, or it may be that it's against what they consider human rights, what they think is against justice. They want justice and they want equality, generally speaking. So this is kind of that principled kind of aspect. But also, as an adolescence, they start to improve in two different things. We can think of kind of these as brain upgrades per se, things that are happening to make perspective taking possible. So in this stage, adolescents are finally able to step into someone else's shoes. They're able to consider what that person may have felt in different situations, and it can come from a very completely viewpoint than their own. So this is where they start to understand everyone has their own perspective. And if we're familiar with social emotional learning in a school kind of setting, perspective taking is a really big social emotional learning topic that is being taught to adolescents. And then we can think of considering broader principles. This is where they start to look at the big picture of things. They start to consider how a single action is actually going to affect the community, themselves, the world, things from a bigger principle. So kind of taken all together, adolescence is when morality becomes a lot more personal to them. So it's not just about what they are told to do, it's about who they choose to be and the values that they actually want to stand for. So now we're going to jump into the next stage, which is adulthood. All right, so now we're at the last stage of kind of development of moral development per se, but actually as we enter adulthood, our moral development starts to stabilize. While children and adolescents are often navigating kind of the new social rules and perspectives and the shifting peer groups, adults tend to be a lot more established and have that established baseline and foundation for how they view right and wrong. So overall, according to some research done in 1983, we see fewer drastic swings in moral logic as we age and as we get older. So things are ultimately a lot more stable. However, sustainability doesn't mean that we actually stop growing. Adult moral development is actually heavily influenced by our life experiences, whether they're positive, negative, how we want to kind of move forward in our life. So significant events like becoming a parent, losing a loved one, getting married, or navigating, really challenging, complex workplace ethics or shifts in our perspective often are kind of events that may force us to encounter changes in this perspective. However, this is where we can really refine what those moral values and moral development and the outlook morally kind of looks like. So there's many different things that can occur during this stage. But perhaps the most important part of development is that formation of kind of moral identity, being what we call moral person per se. In 1984, researchers began kind of establishing and saying that, being a moral person actually starts to move and be kind of the center of who we want to be in this adulthood. For an adult, acting morally isn't just about following the rules, it's about being true to yourself. So that perspective is, who am I really and who do I want to kind of portray out to the world? So when our identity is tied to our morals, we are much more likely to act pro-socially, because failing to do so would mean we are betraying who we are at our core, right? So we want to really just be ourselves in this kind of stage. So as we kind of wrap this all up, in adulthood, morality is actually no longer just those set of rules, but it's actually a deeply personal part of our identity that we refine as we kind of go and we continue into the world. So as we wrap everything up, I kind of want to kind of put a nice bow on this and kind of look at the bigger picture of everything, of how we evolve into moral beings. So we move through kind of a massive timeline today, all the way from infancy to adulthood, which, basically spans our whole entire life. So we saw and we identified infancy brings those early emerging moral preferences. So this is that gut feeling linking to be a helper. In childhood, we then bring those perspectives to rules, and there's the deep focus about fairness and unfairness with the desire of fairness overall. Then in adolescence, we develop that critical thinking stage, that abstract reasoning stage, and we start to ask that question, why? So we start to form our own moral identity based on what those answers to that why is. And then finally, in adulthood, we see that our identity integrates into our real world experiences and we become a lot more stable as an individual with our moral compass. But kind of beyond the logic and rules, we have to remember that our emotions are central to this entire process. Morality isn't just kind of like A plus B equals C, it's oftentimes a lot how we feel. So it's based on empathy, which is that way we can kind of support prosocial behavior. It's kind of the reason why we help, but we really kind of are able to bond and put ourselves in other people's shoes. Also, we may make decisions based off of guilt. It isn't just this negative feeling, but it's a functional tool that kind of helps us repair when we've messed up. It helps us identify when we may feel in the wrong. And ultimately, our moral identity. This is how much we value being a good person. And it's the best predictor of whether or not we're going to take actions in matters that, actually matter the most. So as we think about it overall, moral development is a lifelong journey. From the moment we're born to the moment we die, it is a journey. And it's kind of a combination of balancing our internal feelings and what the external world and our environment have to offer. So ultimately, it starts with a baby reaching for help to support, an adult standing up for their deepest, thoughts, feelings, and beliefs. So this is something that we're always working on, and we may identify ourselves in a particular stage. Maybe we're in that adulthood kind of stage where we're integrating it into our identity. But I want you to kind of reflect and take some time to think about how moral development has kind of established itself for you as we kind of go throughout this topic for the week. All right, I hope you have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next week. Bye.